Queensland University of Technology did a major research project into the decision-making factors. This was in fact about teachers reporting on child protection matters. I think the issues of potential abuse within an institution or a school that you're working in and reporting on one of your colleagues is even more complex. However, this research is helpful about beginning to look at how your peers make their decisions. So there were a number of areas that affected them. There were characteristics associated with the case, the actual case of the abuse and the child. There were other characteristics that pertain to the individual teacher as a person and as a professional. And the third set of characteristics pertained to the school that they were working in. And it's a combination of those three things that either, if you like, supported a teacher to make a report and do something, or acted as an inhibitor so that they didn't make a report. So the actual case characteristics were the particular kinds of abuse. And as I said, the easiest kind of abuse for reporting was that physical abuse. People could actually see it, it was bruises and whatever. Emotional abuse, very rarely reported, not perceived. I think there's been, and this research is about 10 years old, I think there's been changes because of the internet and the whole bullying thing. We're much clearer about that than we were. Sexual abuse, again, not necessarily high levels of reporting, mainly because of issues of recognition, people not recognising and detecting, or also not feeling comfortable within their organisation or with the parents of the children that by reporting they would be doing anything positive. So that was always a concern, that there's something about this child, if I report this, there's going to be more harm caused. Can I just check something? You're going to hold a finger up at me 5 minutes before I've got a... Good. I'm sorry, just got to make sure I get the finger up here. Okay. The other thing that affected a teacher's experience was their perception of the seriousness of the abuse or the neglect. So whether they, for instance, a child who had a broken limb would be seen to be worthy of reporting, but if they just came with maybe some hand marks on their arm or something like that, then there would be a different view. So there was certainly an issue of seriousness. One of the problems with that is that one of the major concerns about children particularly experiencing abuse is what's called cumulative harm. So once a child has actually experienced abuse at the hands of a trusted adult, a second experience of abuse, in fact, has a magnified impact on the child's well-being. So what's happened here is, again, there were issues about the obvious and what was perceived as really serious as opposed to not really serious. And that's obviously sets of values. And I think that's also tempered by your own parenting experiences, some of the characteristics of the teachers. When we go through the teachers' stuff, you'll see how these all interplay in terms of somebody making a decision of, is this child being abused or not? And then the next one, which is, if I take action about that, am I going to make the situation better or worse? And so there's those two definite stages. The characteristics of the child, there's been a higher level of reporting of Aboriginal children generally than non-Aboriginal children. Issues around, say, children with disabilities as well, because there are a number of children that, because of particular characteristics, have high levels of vulnerability, and certainly Aboriginal and Torres Strait children are one group, children with a disability are another group, and they have very particular complexities because, again, with children with a disability, often the nature of the caring relation requires intimate touching. If you're bathing and moving people around and doing whatever. And so one of the issues is that we know, and the work of the Royal Commission is really clearly showing us, that there's extraordinarily high levels of abuse within the disability community, but we are not clear about separating the abuse from the intimate caring and functions that we'd have. And this is, I think, some of the issues too around that I was talking earlier about parenting, of what is in fact parenting, and that just natural role of parenting, versus some sort of intrusion into somebody's privacy and whatever. And the other issues are obviously family factors, and these are quite interesting. So the family factors include whether the family are relating nicely to the teacher, whether they talk nicely to you, or whether they in fact swear at you, or threaten you, or whatever else. And it was quite clear that where people treated the teachers nicely, behaved in a polite and courteous manner, there was much less likelihood that they were going to get reported to the action stage. It had nothing to do with, in fact, whether they may have or may not have been abusing. It was actually a level of relationship. And I think that's really important. One of the people over the break was saying to me how incredibly difficult it would be to go to a colleague who you respected and regarded as a friend and say, I think your behaviour is questionable here. That is a really hard thing, and that's something that we as human beings need to acknowledge in ourselves, that we don't want to fear about, we don't want to think about people like that. We want to give them the benefit of the doubt. And so these factors all came in terms of what was going on with the child. The teacher characteristics that adhered to the teachers themselves were the level and degree of experience, their gender, their parental status, all of those sorts of things. And I think another one that was in there was the knowledge of the indicators of child abuse and neglect, and this is quite critical. It's most teachers under this research didn't actually know what the indicators of abuse are and what they meant and how you actually operationalise them to use them in a decision, and wouldn't know how to report them in a report. And a lot of them also had, if they had training, it was quite a few years ago. How many of you, for instance, had training in your teacher training on identifying child abuse? Okay, it's about 8. So how many of you have, subsequent to joining your profession, had training as part of your staff development training program? Much better, but like probably 20%. So I'm presuming that the rest of you haven't had training about child abuse and what the indicators are and how you identify it. And the teachers themselves actually have identified that as one of the major barriers. They don't know. They actually don't know, and therefore the impact of some of those emotional issues of relationship or who's nice, who's good, whatever, they're riding on the seat of their pants, and those things are taking a great deal of weight. So obviously one of the recommendations to move forward in this is to actually begin to talk about how do teachers actually keep up to date on understanding what that is and what it means. And their concerns and fears of the negative consequences of reporting. And the concerns and fears were a multitude, and in terms of institutional abuse, they're going to be increased. So they've always been around the child protection system, perceptions that it's not a good system, and to put a kid into it's not going to do their life chances any good or whatever. The concerns that they might disrupt a relationship with parents that they thought that they were beginning to forge, which might be, and thinking, if I form this relationship with these parents and I can support and help them, maybe we'll get through this. And it's similar with a colleague. Maybe if I can, form this relationship and talk to them and work and help them, we'll all get through this together. That is, and on the other side of that is the issue of if I report them, they could get sacked, or the parents may not want to, engage with me anymore, or whatever. And so there's, in teachers' minds, when they're thinking about whether they're going to take action, playing out all of those scenarios depending on who the people are in that setting is actually a very strong determinant of whether they'll take action. One of the issues that's coming out with the new legislation is that that's going to be out of your hands, in the sense that there will now be, if that matter ever gets to jurisdiction and you hadn't reported, then in fact you may be subject to civil litigation. So there will in fact be a lot more of a push. So having those tools of actually understanding what the indicators are and the process that you need to go through for reporting becomes quite critical. And the other thing that's around about it is that issue of belief, and it was where I started talking this morning, where the schools, what the role of schools are. What is its role? Should it be involved in these sorts of child protection, family issues? How far should it go? Now, in the sorts of schools that you're working in, you actually have another conundrum, because many of you are part of not only schools, but you're part of faith communities. So you know your peers and colleagues, you know your parents and families, not only at the school, but perhaps at church or at a fellowship group or at some sort of organisation or activity. And the more enmeshed you are, the harder it is to make these decisions in a clearly objective, externalised way. So, and that's one of the things that's quite clearly coming out of the inquiries in Australia, and that's why the Victorian inquiry, well, it talked about general organisations, but it did talk again about faith-based organisations, and certainly the Royal Commission itself is also talking about that. And it's part of those ties of actually thinking, well, no, I'm not reading that, giving the benefit of the doubt. And so it's going to be quite difficult for many of you as teachers to begin to pull and separate that role out from those other relationships you have with the same people in other roles. And then the other issue is this individual framework of what information, how much information do you need as an individual before you will make a judgment? And each of us, in the way that we process cognitively, require a certain amount and quality of information before we actually think, okay, yes, I think that's the way it is, because this world's and particularly in these areas where, you don't have you don't have witnesses, you're pulling together a lot of circumstantial facts, you're pulling together interpretations of behaviours when you're working with a child and whatever. So the degree of confidence that you feel and the level of information you feel you require to make a judgment, and then once you've actually made a judgment of, no, this is not an issue, or yes, this does seem to be an issue, then you have a second level, which is, now do I take action about it? What would I do about it? And there's a whole level of other things then that actually influence the way that you will make or take action. And a lot of people will make a judgment of, yes, there is an issue, but I'm not going to interfere, I'm not going to take action because, look, I know him, he's a nice bloke, it'll disrupt the community, and it'll just be horrible. And yes, so there's a whole range of thinking that we need to work through, and that's why it is so utterly critical that codes of conduct are living documents for all of you, because you all will need the opportunity to talk with your colleagues about how horrible that might feel for you to have to make those decisions and to say those things and, if you like, feel like you might be even betraying people. So I think that that's one of the things that we've got to look at as well, is that you are all individuals and you all have feelings about those sorts of relationships. But in this setting, the matter of protecting our children and keeping them safe overrides all of that. And that's why there needs to be an absolutely open partnership between the management of your organisations and you as the staff of the organisations in terms of how that process happens. It's quite clear that in schools where there are collaborative and supportive peer structures, both formal and informal, that there is high levels of reporting. So one of the things that the teachers' behaviour is showing us is that they will often go to professional colleagues to talk through what that thinking process of, is this a problem, should I do anything? And that's where they go first. So one of the things that we need to do in changing organisations is to recognise that these are difficult decisions and that's the way people handle them, that we actually try and make sure that capacity is resourced. And that may be if you're in a school where you haven't got tight collegial relationships, where you haven't got staff who've got a lot of experience in this field, then maybe it's making sure that somebody, a social worker or a child protection worker is available to the staff or whatever. But it's quite clear that this is not an easy thing. It's not, oh yes, that's the problem, now I'm going to do this. People tear their souls apart about these things of, should I do something, what's it about, what's the consequence, I don't want to hurt people, but. And the reality of it is historically that has meant that children have suffered harm that we should have been protecting them from, and that's why governments are intervening. So I think it's in that area that a lot of the culture change and the practice change should be occurring, or will be occurring, across schools. And then the school characteristics. So the school characteristics are the level of training, well, which is part of what I was just talking about, the level of training and knowledge available in the school community. And interesting enough, one of the strongest dynamics is the role and the attitude of the principals. Most schools have policies or processes where reporting goes from the teacher to the principal of the school. The research data tells us that principals operate on about 63% overall as a group, of about 63% of those reports through. Now there's all sorts of issues there for teachers who actually do go to a principal to report something and then the principal doesn't take an action about how they feel about what they're doing in terms of talking about their colleagues or family schools. But there's all sorts of critical issues again for the principals, because the principals are also managing their organisations in a much broader community context and the reputation of their organisation. They're managing parent relationships and they're managing organisational relationships. But how the principal actually takes on that role and the messages that they give to their staff is probably the strongest dynamic in terms of either supporting or inhibiting whether reporting will occur. So anyway, you can all have a chat to your principals about that. They'll love that. The other thing is the size of the school, and it's interesting. There is some conflicting research about this, but the way that I've interpreted it is that on the whole, it is larger schools that do more reporting. And one of the arguments has been because the larger schools often have a broader range of experienced staff in them, and they also have a lot less of the close binding of the sort of the small community relationship school ones. And so in fact those larger schools tend to, the teachers in those schools tend to be able to report. And then the location of the school, and this is quite interesting because again there's some conflict in the research about perceptions of what type of communities and schools abuse occurs in. And one of the comments I made to the Royal Commission was if you actually watch the Royal Commission, you'd think it all happened in private boys' schools, elite private boys' schools really. And one of the things that I said to them, I thought it was really important to say that that wasn't the case. The other, there's mixed perceptions about whether abuse occurs in middle class schools or schools with lower socio-economic profiles. I think the variable that you can look at in those schools is the higher the proportion of your students that have histories with child protection, the more likely more likely you are to have issues of abuse going on with the school. Right, now I'm going to have to really run. So, for increasing the likelihood of disclosure for children, you need to ensure that they can actually identify and name up what inappropriate adult behaviour looks like, that you've got a common language that you can talk to them about. that they can identify and feel comfortable to talk to safe adults about these things. And the general principle is you should never just link a child to one safe adult in a school. The child should always have multiple linkages, not too many, but if that adult is not available at the time or whatever else, there needs to be somebody. The child needs to have a choice of who they go to. And many of the schools are doing sort of circle of safety pairings, those sorts of strategies. There's some really good programs around about how you make sure children clearly have a safe adults to link to. That they're assured that their concerns will be taken seriously if they do talk to somebody. The other thing is the protective behaviours programs. Those programs teach kids about personal space and their bodies, and that they have private parts, and they give them names. They actually talk about, a vagina or a penis or whatever. They don't usually use those names, depending on who you go to. They have all sorts of, some of them have cutesy names, and some of them actually call them anatomically. But it's actually having the language to name up those. But the first conversation can be that you do have private parts, and they are private, and private means. So it's actually having that sort of conversation. And also being able to name up their feelings, that I feel uncomfortable or I don't feel safe. So actually children don't often know how to name those feelings that they're having. They sort of feel creepy. They know they feel creepy, but they don't know how to tell that to an adult so that the adult will understand. So it's actually beginning with the children that you've got those relationships with to actually get that language. Such programs are essentially part of a child-safe strategy, but they should be integrated into a broader situational management process. So conversations with children and young people should generally be constructed around the concept of rights and responsibilities, such as you have the right to be safe at school, and our school has the responsibility to keep you safe. Yes, of course we can talk about that. And so it's those concepts that need to be introduced. And many children don't report because of embarrassment and shame, the fear of repercussions, or the fear that adults will act inappropriately. So, reporting processes should aim to reduce children and young people's fears and worries by ensuring that they're told exactly how their reports will be managed, including who will be told. Who am I going to tell? They should know that ahead of time. How will their parents be involved? Are you going to tell my parents? What will happen with my parents? They need to know all that. How their confidentiality will be protected. Who's going to be told about this? If I've said this about him, will he be told that I've said this about him? And how the organisation will protect their privacy generally. A group of kids that find out something that goes on, it's like a bushfire, it's wild. So you really need to be clear about that, and you really need to tell the child about all of those things, about their rights in those things. I'm going to very quickly skim through some of these other things. So in terms of increasing the likelihood of disclosure with adults, it's about providing education for the staff and for volunteers that you have in your organisation. Somebody talked to me about your fellowship groups and that you have young people leading fellowship groups, and that's a recipe for disaster. So you really need to be working with your volunteers, and particularly you need to be making sure that people are not working singly in those sorts of situations with small groups of children, or that there's some process that they've got some linkage so that you're clear. You need to decrease the risk. So by educating people, you decrease the risk of the abuse occurring. You also, by the education process and opening up the dialogue, increase the likelihood of the abuse being detected. You begin to form a language in your culture where people can actually begin to talk about it and identify what the message is. And you can increase the likelihood that the disclosures will be responded to. And again, you need to actually understand and recognise what grooming behaviour looks like. I won't go through that one because we talked about grooming earlier. So educating and providing information to parents provides, who's the third group, provides them with tools to engage with their children around the issues of risks and actual abuse. It encourages and validates the parents to report to the school when they've got concerns. And one of the issues that we've got is having parents understand the same language that you're using with the kids at school. That really you all need to have the same language about talking about bits of bodies and what these things mean, about feelings, what feeling unsafe means, etc. And it also provides a clear message to the school that the child safety is a core cultural value in the school. And I'm nearly there. My timekeeper here. So research indicates that if victims of abuse receive a non-supportive response when they disclose that abuse, then they're worse off than victims who don't disclose at all. So the most immediate priority for an organisation when it's occurred is to report that and to support the child and young person. It is never, under any circumstances, up to an organisation to determine eternally whether the abuse has or has not taken place, or whether a child is or is not lying about abuse. The boundary of what you should be doing at the school stops before that. That's an investigation function, and that is not a power that the school has, or that any organisation has. So a child-safe organisation reports suspected abuse to the appropriate authorities, shares information appropriately and lawfully, and you need to understand that's the other piece of information around this area. What does the law say you should be doing? What do you need to tell a child protection worker? What do you need to tell police when you are reporting these matters? So you need to be able to understand what those requirements are when you're dealing with a child at risk, and also values and communicates with their parents and their carers. But the other thing is that if abuse does occur in an organisation, you need to have the capacity then to review your policies, processes and programs so that they can improve. It's not the end of the world, it's the beginning of a better world if you use that information to change and improve your organisation. I think it's absolutely essential for every person who is working with young people to understand basic principles of situational management. You do not go into a place alone with a young person. You do not communicate by text outside. So you actually, and you need to have those rules and be very clear about them. The issue, so if everybody knows those rules and is working in them, then I don't think there is a real or a major concern, other than the horrible feelings that happen, about the fact that they're going to be hung, dried and quartered for something that they didn't do. So if people know what the code is, they know what the behaviours are, and they're living in that, then essentially they can in fact defend themselves quite clearly by presenting the facts in an investigation. I think the issue that we've got is that the performance, and I'll talk about schools, but please don't take this as about schools are the worst thing in the world. It's not just schools, it's a whole lot of other organisations, but let's just talk about schools because that's where you come from. The historic performance of schools in these areas has been so variable, and there are so many dynamics that have allowed people who were at risk or who were abused to not have any access to support or redress, that governments have now decided to take it out of the hands of all schools. So I think, and people might think that that's like sucking on a piece of lemon, or they might not. But that, I think, is the historical reality that we've come to. I think we haven't yet got to a future, and I was just talking to Brian and, what's your name? Linda. And Lorraine earlier about, we haven't yet also got to people who have been refused jobs or dismissed from schools because of suspicions of whatever, taking legal damage acts against the organisations. We haven't got there. And we're certainly going to have that in terms of the registration processes that are occurring at the state level, that people who have been refused registration to work with children, there will, I have absolutely no doubt, within the next 3 or 4 years, people will start challenging that they have been unfairly denied access to employment because of an unsubstantiated claim. So we haven't yet worked through all those issues. It's almost like we've gone from here, which has been too lax, to this high level of transparency and compliance. And because our organisations are not sophisticated about how we do this, I think people are going to feel very uncomfortable with it. And the people who get caught in it are going to feel very uncomfortable. The only way that I can find for me to live with all of that, because I'm one of these crazy social justice committed persons, is to say at the end point the intent of this is to change the culture of our organisations so children will be kept safe. And I know that they're not kept safe now. So I think this is a process that we have to go through. My own view is that there are people that manipulate systems. They're not actually common. The research shows us, because we've had this in women bringing rape accusations for years, and I'm very familiar with all of that as well. People making false accusations is not a common thing, but it does occur. And I think if you have well substantiated facts, if you know and you have followed those procedures, then people can defend themselves in those procedures. However, it does not save the heartache. I mean, this whole area is absolutely full of heartache. I wish I could say there was a nice way that can do this. I think that governments are doing the only thing that they can. But I also know that the law and those sorts of compliance structures are really blunt instruments. And people get hurt. Their feelings get hurt. Hopefully they won't generate injustice, which is what you're talking about. I think we can protect against the injustice. I don't think we can protect against the hurt feelings. Well, the reality of it is, if a child is lying about abuse, they've got issues, and it's not going to be behaviour that, if they continue it, that's going to lead to positive outcomes in their life. However, it's the point at which that decision is made, I think, that these processes change. And one of the realities, that is really hard, and this is the one that lands in the principal's lap, is in an environment like this, or a process where there's been a complaint made and you've got the parties, you've actually got somebody investigating it, you've got potentially a school community trying to support a child victim, the parents of the child victim, the staff member who may have the allegation against them, and the rest of the school community. And, dare I say it, from what I've learned, trying to support and keep their board informed and whatever structure they have. And that's one hell of a balancing act. So I think I would be expecting that a school would look at those. But at the end of the day, if somebody comes back and says, no, police come back and say, no, there isn't evidence that that person, and the other thing I've got, and this is I can't comment on Victoria Police, but in my own state, I respect police investigations really quite significantly. They do a very good job, and they're pretty good at this stuff. But it's still heartache for everybody in the line. Yeah. I don't know whether any of you have been watching telly about 7 or 8 days ago, but the National Scout Jamboree camp was on, and what happened was there was an allegation of sexual abuse by a scoutmaster against a young person, and it was reported immediately by the child and the other peers to whoever was in charge of the National Jamboree, and they waited 4 days before reporting it to police, and they've now been called to account for why they waited 4 days. I think 5 years ago that would have been they didn't report at all. Now it's not your job to investigate. As soon as you had that report, it needed to be coming to police. But that's part of that legal stuff as well, because one of the other things is that teachers and principals are not feeling comfortable about how you actually make that report to police, or how you make that report to your Child Protection Service in a way that is fair and equitable and presents the facts, you know, in terms of a natural justice framework. And I don't think a lot of people have got their head around how much skilling up this is going to take. It's actually a very different field than all of you have been working in, and it's very complex. And I'm even beginning to talk, this lady's question about a child who would be endemically lying or displaying trauma-type behaviours, beginning to try and explain, you know, say emotional abuse to a police officer and get them to actually understand, from you understanding developmental psychology and what's appropriate behaviour at a certain age or not at a certain age. That writing reports up for that, it's really hard. So there's a lot of skilling up that's got to go into this area.